keep your eyes open to see what God's doing. But I was thinking about this whole idea because we talked about all through VBS, and last Sunday, the lesson was about how God's power pulls us through. And I know tomorrow we're going to have a bunch of neat testimonies as we have Teen Challenge here sharing about God's power pulling them through some incredible life experiences. But I was thinking about that. What does it look like in an everyday life for God's power to pull us through? Do we have examples of that we can look at? And because it's one thing to hear about something, it's another thing to actually see it and understand it. Here's one of those things that's really hard for people to grasp, and that is the aurora borealis, the northern lights. If you've never seen them, you might have heard of them. You go, well, that I don't know, that sounds kind of fake. And it does sound kind of fake until you actually see them for yourself. And then you're just like, wow, God is awesome. Look at this. And it's just mesmerizing. But it's hard to describe if someone hasn't seen it. And so what I want to do tonight is just give us an example from Scripture of not only what a life looks like that has seen the power of God pull them through, but also the key to letting God's power pull you through whatever situation you're in. And to help us understand that, I want us to look in the Bible at a story found in 1 Kings. 1 Kings is near the front of the Bible, so and pretty easy. 1st and 2nd Kings are kind of a big section. You should find it. And we're in chapter 17. And we're in a portion in chapter 17 that's talking about Elijah the prophet, the man of God, and how he had prayed for the fact that God, let there be no rain. And so for this time, in fact, it didn't rain until he prayed again. And so this drought is setting in. He had been divinely taken care of by birds who brought him food for a while, but the stream he was at dried up, and now the story picks up because he's moving. And we find a very interesting story about someone who needs the power of God to pull them through. And it says this, and starting in verse 7. Sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath of Sidon. Stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? As she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. As surely as the Lord your God lives, he replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil, or a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home to make a meal for myself and my son, so that we may eat it and die. Talk about someone being in a situation where they need the power of God to pull them through. Here was a situation that seemed completely hopeless. There's this famine going on. All the resources had run out. This widow had just enough to make a last meal for her and her son, and then they were going to basically lay down and die of starvation. That was her plan. That was life. But look at what Elijah says in verse 13. He said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. Okay, now if a prophet, because she knew he was a prophet, because she said, if you go back, as surely as the Lord your God lives, okay, she knew that this was a man of God. And he says, okay, you're going to make food and die? Yeah, go ahead and do that. That doesn't sound too encouraging, does it? It doesn't sound like any power to pull you through. But let's not stop there. Let's go back. Okay, so verse 13. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make some for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord gives rain on the land. She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah, for the woman, and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. To me, this is one of the most amazing stories of God stepping in to everyday life, stepping into a situation where someone was in desperate need of God's power to pull them through, and yet it didn't come in a way that seems logical. And yet, as we look at what happened here, and we look at what God said, and how this lady, we don't even know her name, she's just a widow of Zarephath. As we look at how this widow responded, there's some things we can learn and apply to our lives that will help us get through any situation we face. Because I don't think any of us are so desperate that we're going to go home, eat a meal, and curl up and die. I don't think that's our plan for the rest of the day. I don't think that's planned for this week. So we're not in that desperate a situation. If God can pull her through that desperate a situation, God can pull us through anything that we face if we'll just follow some keys or some guidelines to help us do that. And they're found in this simple story. The very first one is this. For Jesus' power to pull us through, we have to know and admit our problems. For Jesus' power to pull us through, we have to know and admit our problems. So often, we know it, but we won't admit it. It's kind of like going to the doctor. You're not feeling well. You go to the doctor, and as you're meeting with the doctor says, well, how are you feeling? And you give about a tenth of the way you really feel. And you cover over the other 90% because you don't want to look like you're falling apart. So you don't tell the whole truth. So the doctor deals with the tenth. Oh, my toe's been hurting, doc. And you don't go into the fact that your back's hurting, your neck's hurting, everything's seized up. So the doctor looks at you and says, oh, you have an ingrown toenail. I'll deal with that. It's done. And you walk out of there as much of a cripple as you went in because everything else is still not dealt with because you weren't willing to admit the problems that you had. You weren't willing to admit it. And we need to understand that this widow is simple, to the point, and honest. She was desperate. And she goes, I can't do what you're asking me to do because I just have enough flour and oil to make a last meal for me and my son. And we're going to eat that and then we're going to die. That's the plan. That's the agenda. That's the after dinner activities that we have planned because what we have isn't enough to sustain us. So we're just going to curl up and die. She knew the desperation she was in, and she was willing to admit it. She admitted it first to herself, and then she admitted it to God. Because remember, in the Old Testament, people didn't come in, not very often did they come and talk to God themselves. They always went through the man of God or the prophet. And so when she's admitting this to the prophet, the man of God, she's admitting it to God, saying, this is my need, this is a problem I face, and because I face this problem, I can't do what you're asking. She didn't try to cover over anything. She didn't try to pretend. You know how when you meet people in group settings, whether it's church or the supermarket, and you say, hey, how are you doing? They put on a smile and say, I'm doing fine. That is the most common lie people tell in the world today, I think. Because we're not doing fine. Well, I don't want to burden them with all my problems. Doesn't the Bible say carry one another's burdens? So how can we do that unless we're honest? We need to be honest. And often misplaced pride prevents us from being honest to ourselves and to others. It prevents us from being factual about what's going on in our life. We're not supposed to paint it worse than it is, but we're not supposed to make it look better than it is. We're just supposed to say, hey, this is the truth of what's going on. And we share it. And when we're willing to admit it to ourselves and then share it with other people, God can step in and make all the difference. But until we're willing to do that, it's not going to happen. We have to understand the amount of help we receive from God is directly related to how honest we are willing to be. The amount of help we are willing or that we will receive from God is directly related to how honest we are willing to be. If you walk in to the dentist and say, oh no, nothing's wrong with my teeth, I'm doing fine, and he opens your mouth and it looks like your teeth are about to fall out or rot in half, and he goes, are you sure this doesn't hurt? And he's jabbing in that wonderful little tool that he jabs in your teeth, and you're wincing in pain. You go, no, it doesn't hurt at all. Okay, you're not being honest. He knows the truth. You know the truth, but you're not willing to admit the truth. Well, when it comes to God, God already knows everything. He says, I want you to be honest and truthful and trust me enough to admit it so that I can help. My help is connected or dependent upon whether you're willing to ask for it or not. So as honest as you're willing to be is how much your help I'm willing to give you. And so if we just try to sugarcoat our problems with God, we're going to get sugar back from God. But if we're honest, God will meet us right where we're at. And I love the fact that verse in there that I stopped at that didn't seem to make a lot of sense. Remember down in verse 13 where Elijah says, don't be afraid. Go home and do it as you have said. He wasn't being callous. He wasn't saying go home and die. He was saying, okay, go ahead, make the cake you're going to make for you and your son so you can have this meal, but first make one for me. And then he throws out this promise that doesn't seem like it makes any sense. She knows how much flour she has and how much oil she has. Just enough to make one cake for her and her son. They're going to split this cake, and then they're completely out of hope, out of food. But God says, you've admitted it. Now, trust me. And he doesn't just say it that way. If you go back to the text, I want to read it again, where it says, verse 13, Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. I want you to think about that for a second. How many of us face a situation where we're afraid to admit it to ourselves because of what the consequences might be? We're afraid to admit it to others because how they might judge us or what might happen. And God is trying to tell all of us, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Walk out, do what you have planned. It seems like a good idea, but guess what? I'm going to tweak it because when you make the cake and you give it to me, I will take care of you until you don't need that care anymore. And so there was this reassurance followed by a promise. And as we look at that, it brings us to our second point, which is simply this. For Jesus' power to pull us through, we have to fully surrender all of life to Him. Not just surrender part of it, not just the cleaned up parts that we think will be acceptable. It's like surrender all of it. So I want you to think about this. The widow's death plan. Because that's what it was. I'm going to eat cake with my son and we're going to lay down and die. Her death plan, she had to surrender to Him. From the very beginning of the plan, she was going to make a cake. They were going to eat it and lay down and die. And God says, okay, that's the plan. I'm going to tweak it a bit. But before you eat the cake yourself, make another one for the man of God. And don't worry about it because I got a surprise for you. There was this reassurance followed by a promise. And she had to surrender everything. Even her plan to die, she had to surrender to God. You see, when we've given up hope and we think we should just lay down and die, God wants to breathe hope into that situation no matter what it is. And He says, don't worry, when you add me to whatever your plans are, whatever you're making, when you add me to it, the result is going to be incredible. But to add me, you have to surrender everything. Are you willing to surrender everything to me? The bad, the horrible, the normal, everyday, and the really, really good. Are you willing to surrender it all to me? Because when this woman said, well, she didn't say yes, when she demonstrated yes. She surrendered her death plan. She surrendered her son's life. She surrendered her life. She surrendered their future. She surrendered everything to do what God is asking us to do. And she could do this because of God's reassurance, God's promise to her. That reassurance was, do not be afraid. And the promise was, a miracle is going to happen that will take care of you until you don't need that care anymore because all of a sudden things will be growing and supplies will be there. But that happens when we have the courage to fully surrender. And the courage to fully surrender comes from God's reassurances and His promises. The question is, do you know God's reassurances and His promises? Can you tell me a promise of God that applies to your life today? I'll throw out one. I will never leave you or forsake you. That's a promise of God for everyone who has a relationship with Him. If that's His promise, then we should never feel alone, abandoned, and be worried because of it, because God is always there. That's His promise. And it also, we can add the assurance that we find in this story. Do not be afraid. You don't have to be afraid because God's there. He's got our back. He's got our front. He's got our sides. He's got everything. He's there. He will never leave us or forsake us. He also promised to be a friend that sticks closer than a brother. So He's not just there. He's there as a friend. So we need to stop stressing and stop worrying. We just need to hold on to the promise. But you can't hold on to them unless you know them. And you can't know them unless you've read them and can tell them to others, and others can tell them to you. So here's the man of God reminding or telling this lady, because this lady wasn't part of Israel. She was in a different country. She knew that the man of God was going to come and she had to take care of him. And she was like, well, I don't know how much I can do that. We're going to eat bread and die, and that's going to be the end of it. But here the man of God is saying there's a promise that applies to you, because the promises of God aren't just for Israel. They're for everyone who chooses to be a follower of Jesus. And that's a great thing for us, and that we can apply to our life. And so we see that she hears this assurance, she hears this promise, and then I love how she responds. Because it says in verse 15, she went away and did as Elijah had told her. Now remember, Elijah is a man of God, therefore she went away and did as God had told her to do. How many of us will walk out of church, walk away from a time of Bible study, and we immediately do what God's told us to do? Or how many of us go, well, that's nice, God, but we need to tweak it to fit my life. You don't really understand what's going on, so I have to tweak it and change it so it can apply to my life. Now, none of us want to admit that, but I think most of us, that's the way we function. Okay, God, you said this, but you don't really understand 2021 and everything that's going on and everything that's happening in my life at this age. And yes, I think of myself as 25, but I'm not 25 anymore. I'm twice that old and my body is twice as worn out. So I have to tweak what you're asking me to do to fit this. And then the economy's kind of bad right now because of the whole COVID thing. And so you really don't expect me to financially do what you asked me to do. You want me to tweak that to make it make sense to me. Did any of what Elijah said to the widow make sense to her? In the logical understanding? None of it did. You only have enough to make one cake and you and your son are going to eat and die, but make another one for me first. It goes against logic. But that's where we have to trust God. We have to trust God, and that's our third point. For Jesus' power to pull us through, we have to trust and obey all that He asks. Not most of what He asks, not a majority of what He asks, not some of what He asks. We have to obey all that He asks. And that's what I love about this lady. She hears the man of God give the word of God and the promise of God and the reassurance of God. And I come back to verse 15. She went away and did as she was told. I wish it was that easy for us today, where we hear what God says and we just simply go do it. But we don't. We make it so much harder. It's not about simply obeying. We have to change it and tweak it and make it 2021 in the United States of America. No. You hear, obey. That's it. Just simply hear it and obey it. And if we go back, it says that, so there was food every day for Elijah, for the woman, and her family. This provision, this promise that God had given them was only available when she determined to be obedient. Completely obedient in everything. She just went and did it. And that simple obedience will always change everything. I want you to think about that. So often we try to make it so hard, but the simple obedience will always change everything. Now, it didn't just change everything for the lady. The lady was taken care of. She had food until she didn't need that food anymore. Elijah was taken care of. So the man of God was taken care of. Why? Because she just simply obeyed and gave God everything and trusted God with everything and did what she was told. But then it says that not only was her son taken care of, did you catch that? It didn't say her and her son. It said her and her family, which means brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, cousins. Her family was taken care of because of her simple act of obedience. It changed everything for the people she was related to. So God's blessings and God's promises aren't just for us and will not just pull us through tough times. But if we simply obey what God has asked, those blessings, that reassurance, that promise will impact everyone around us in a positive way, because God's blessings are never meant to be kept to ourselves. They're always meant to be shared with those. I want you to think about that, because this is an incredible testimony from God's Word of how His power can pull us through anything. And it's there to change everything. The question is, are we willing to do these three simple things? Are we willing to start off and know and admit our problems? And if we are willing to know and admit our problems, are we willing to fully surrender all of them? Because there's a difference between knowing and admitting and then surrendering. There's a huge difference. If you want to see the difference, try taking a toddler to the dentist. They know their teeth hurt, they know they need something done, but they don't want to submit to a needle going in their little gums so that the dog, some of the adults don't like that either. There's a difference between knowing and surrendering. So we need to get to that point of full surrender. Not only do we know our problems, but we also know God well enough that we're willing to surrender everything to Him. And then we show that surrender by trusting and obeying what He's asked. Trusting and obeying what He's asked us. If you are facing a situation today where you know you need God's power to pull you through, are you doing these? Because if you're not, there's no guarantee God's power is going to pull you through. Because He's made it dependent on us and our response to His reassurances and His promise. His reassurance is He will take care of everything and He will walk us through whatever we're facing. The promise is that it'll all turn out for His glory in the end. The question is, are we willing to do what He's asked us? I want you to think about that as we take a moment to bow our heads and look at applying this to our life. As we've gone through this simple story, a testimony of how God's power can pull us through. Maybe God's brought to mind a situation that you're facing, and you're going, I don't know, God. This seems impossible. This seems unsurmountable. And God's saying, don't worry, I've got it. I will get you through this. All you have to do is trust me. Be honest about your situation. Admit it. Then be willing to surrender all of life. Your hopes, your dreams, your successes, your failures. The everyday status quo. Surrender it all to me. And then just simply trust and obey what I've asked you to do. And watch results. So as you've looked at your life and you've thought about that, if God's brought a situation to your mind that seems like that insurmountable thing, and He's asking you to trust Him with it, are you willing to be honest about it? Are you willing to surrender it all to Him? And then are you willing to obey Him as He challenges you to step out in faith? Because if you're willing to do that, He will pull you through in such a way that the blessings will overflow from your life and impact those around. Now you might be going, Pastor Rob, yeah, I'm there. I'm there. Well, I'm going to ask you to demonstrate your trust and obedience. It's just a simple act, but it can make all the difference in the world. And I ask you to do it with your heads bowed and your eyes closed so that you're not worried about what other people think. But I'm asking you to physically respond. So even if you're at home and you're watching this, I want you to respond and do this. If you know you're facing a situation that seems hopeless and you need the power of God to pull you through it, and you know you're willing to do these steps, you're willing to admit it, be honest about it, you're willing to surrender it all and all of life to God, and you're willing to trust and obey whatever He asks you to do, if that's you and you want to see God's power pull you through, like I said, whether you're watching online or whether you're here, if God's talking to you, I want you to raise your hand and say, Pastor Rob, God is challenging me, but I want to